It was one of the most controversial cases of the 19th century. A young servant girl charged with 3 counts of attempted murder, a case built on circumstantial evidence and deeply rooted class bias, and a verdict that continues to haunt historians and legal scholars to this day. Welcome back to Victorian True Crime. Today, we're talking about the questionable conviction of Eliza Fenning. Okay, so this one's not technically in the Victorian period. It takes place in 1815, so more like Regency true crime. Nitpickier scholars will hate me for this, but I tend to use Victorian as a shorthand for anything 19th century British, so you know what? We're going with it. In March of 1815, Eliza Fenning was a 22-year-old domestic servant in the employ of the Turner family at number 68 Chancery Lane, London. Hailing from a very poor family, Eliza had been in service since the age of 14 and had held various domestic positions in a number of upper middle-class London households before being hired as a cook for the Turners in January of 1815. The household was made up of the elder Mr. and Mrs. Turner, Orlebar and Margaret, their son Robert, and his wife Charlotte. Also living in the house on Chancery Lane were 2 male apprentices, Roger Gadsden and Thomas King, as well as another domestic servant, a maid named Sarah Peer. Described as an easygoing, amiable, and hardworking young lady, Eliza seemed happy in her new position with the Turner family, and for the first several weeks of her employment, there were no complaints on either end. It wasn't until late February that tensions in the household began to arise, specifically between Eliza and Charlotte, the younger Mrs. Turner. Apparently, Eliza had one night entered the room of the 2 male apprentices, inappropriately dressed, asking to borrow a candle. After learning this, a scandalized Charlotte had berated Eliza and threatened her with dismissal. The threats turned out to be idle, but the confrontation deeply upset Eliza, who afterward confided in Sarah Peer how much she disliked her mistress. Though everyone seemed to put the incident behind them, Charlotte would later claim that the young cook had been surly and disrespectful to her ever since. Eliza was proud of her cooking and had long been asking to be allowed to make her specialty dumplings for the Turners, a request which, for whatever reason, Charlotte had so far always denied. Then, on March 21st, 1815, an unordered portion of yeast was delivered with the usual groceries. As this had been the only ingredient for her dumpling recipe that the household lacked, Eliza once more made her request, and this time, Charlotte relented. She directed Eliza to make a meal of rump steak, potatoes, and dumplings for the family, and a steak pie for the apprentices. Eliza at once set to work, using the yeast to make a dough for both the dumplings and the pie crust. Eliza was alone in the kitchen for all of that afternoon, only dashing out once to make a trip to the baker after setting the dumplings before the fire to rise. When she returned, she was dismayed to see that something had gone wrong. The dumplings had not risen as they should have. Eliza tried to salvage them as best she could, but whatever she did only seemed to make it worse. By the time they arrived at the table, the dumplings were seriously questionable looking, appearing black and heavy rather than light and fluffy. Nevertheless, the Turner family, all except Margaret, who was out at the time, ate them, as did Eliza herself. Almost at once, the 3 Turners, Eliza, and the apprentice Roger Gadsden, who had picked at the dumplings in the kitchen, became violently ill, sweating and vomiting as their stomachs twisted in excruciating pain. A doctor, Henry Ogilvy, was summoned. Upon examination of the patients, Ogilvy immediately suspected poison. Another doctor, John Marshall, was called in for a second opinion. When the Turners identified the dumplings as the likely offender, Marshall conducted an inspection of the kitchen. To the remains of the bowl in which the dumplings had been made, Marshall added water and decanted the mixture. In examining the sediment, he found half a teaspoon of white powder, which he determined to be arsenic. As the one who had prepared the dumplings, suspicion at once fell on Eliza. She herself was still visibly ill when the police questioned her. Despite vehemently denying the accusations of poisoning, Eliza was arrested on charges of attempted murder. Learning of their daughter's plight, her distraught parents immediately set about raising money for her defense. But as desperately poor as they were, the Fennings only managed to raise £5, just enough to procure a barely passable attorney. On the whole, Eliza's legal resources were woefully inadequate compared to those of the wealthy Turners, who had a wide range of legal contacts and experience and made full use of their inside connections. Eliza's trial opened at the Old Bailey on the 11th of April, 1815, before the recorder, that is, a circuit judge in the English legal system, John Sylvester. The case against Eliza was entirely circumstantial. With no hard evidence, the prosecution instead focused heavily on her general behavior, her attitude towards her employers, and her potential access to the poison. Arsenic was a fairly common item in 19th century households, used for killing rats and other vermin. It was discovered that the elder Mr. Turner kept 2 clearly labeled parcels of arsenic in an unlocked drawer in the office where the apprentices worked. 2 weeks before the poisoning, he had noticed that one of the parcels was missing, and the apprentice Roger Gadsden testified that he had previously seen Eliza rooting around the drawer. The prosecution's case rested on the facts that Eliza had specifically pushed to make the dumplings, that she was alone in the kitchen during the preparation, and that she was familiar with and had access to the drawer in which the arsenic was kept. Eliza herself insisted that the arsenic could not have been in the dough, which was backed up by the fact that the same dough had been used to make the steak pie, with no ill effect. She instead claimed that the poison must have been in the sauce, which Charlotte herself had prepared. But the second doctor, John Marshall, had examined the ingredients and stated that he detected no trace of arsenic in the flour nor in the milk, seeming to imply that it must have been in the yeast. As for Eliza's motive, the prosecution argued that her previous clash with Charlotte Turner had made her so resentful that she had decided to murder the entire family. One particularly damning accusation came again from the apprentice Roger Gadsden, who claimed that he had been in the kitchen with Eliza prior to the fateful dinner, and when he had moved to sample a dumpling, she had warned him against it. Eliza denied that any such conversation had ever taken place, and begged that the other apprentice, Thomas King, be called in to back her up. This request was denied. Henry Ogilvy, the doctor who had attended the Turners and Eliza immediately after the fact, and who would have testified to the severity of her own symptoms, was also not called. The defense tried to prove that Charlotte Turner harbored searing ill will towards Eliza, and called multiple character witnesses to testify on her behalf. But even at the time, it was clear to everyone that the trial was seriously one-sided. A notorious hanging judge, the recorder John Sylvester, was blatantly biased against Eliza and spared no punches in his summing up. At the end of this sad excuse for a trial, the jury found Eliza guilty, and Sylvester sentenced her to death. Public outcry was immediate and ferocious. Even in the middle class, but especially amongst the working class, there was massive support for Eliza. Perfect strangers and even some high-profile advocates like writer William Hone joined her friends and family in their efforts to procure a remission of the sentence. Many prominent public figures drew up petitions, appealing to the Home Secretary, the Prince Regent, anyone with influence. One advocate uncovered evidence that Robert Turner had had previous episodes of mental instability, one in which, quote, appearing wild and deranged, end quote, he had threatened to kill both his wife and himself. This evidence was sent to Sylvester, who dismissed it as wholly useless. Even old Olibar Turner seemed to feel a twinge of conscience after the outcome of the trial. In fact, the elder Mr. Turner was on the verge of signing the petition to save Eliza's life when he was interrupted by none other than the recorder John Sylvester himself, who threatened to turn the investigation on the Turner family if Olibar took action that would so expressly undermine the sentence he had handed down. Indeed, John Sylvester seems to have had a decidedly personal and disturbingly influential hand in blocking mercy for Eliza at every turn. It's been argued that the reason Sylvester was so intent on seeing Eliza hang was because he wished to make an example of her, to show other servants in no vague terms what would happen to them if they attempted to harm their betters. In the end, the efforts of Eliza's supporters were in vain. John Sylvester's hold over the case prevailed, and on July 26, 1815, Eliza was escorted in chains to the gallows. She protested her innocence to the very end, declaring from the scaffold, quote, before the just and almighty God, and by the faith of the holy sacrament I have taken, I am innocent of the offense with which I am charged, end quote. Eliza Fenning was hanged alongside two other criminals, a child rapist and a homosexual man. Eliza's parents were charged 14 shillings and 6 pence for her body. The poor Fennings, further impoverished by their efforts to save their daughter, had to borrow the money to obtain her body for burial. At her funeral, the pall was accompanied by 6 girls dressed in white, and as many as 10,000 mourners marched in the procession to the grave. In the wake of Eliza's execution, a mob of over 1,000 angry Londoners gathered outside the Turner home, threatening to burn it down. Police were brought in to disperse the mob, but crowds continued to gather at the Turner house, necessitating police presence for days. The writer William Hone, who had so fiercely championed Eliza throughout her ordeal, continued his advocacy after her execution. In what is regarded as a landmark work in investigative journalism, he wrote a book on the miscarriage of justice that had been dealt to Eliza Fenning, in which he demolished the prosecution's case, detailed the efforts that the establishment had taken to ensure that she was executed, argued that the son, Robert Turner, should have been looked at more closely, and vehemently condemned John Sylvester's shocking intervention efforts. To men like William Hone, to all of Eliza's supporters, and to the crowds of poor and angry Londoners, it seemed clear that a defenseless working woman had not only been denied justice, but had been judiciously murdered to send a message. Today, the overwhelming opinion is that Eliza was innocent, or at the very least that there was not sufficient evidence to convict her.